and welcome to the What If podcast, where we reimagine our realities. My name is Nonsegele Lonzula, and I am joined by Tendai Marisa. Tendai.
Thank you. Hi.
How are you?
Good, thanks. How are you doing?
I am fine.
Good.
Today I'm excited. We are looking at one of his publications called Africa's Path that was published in August. Did I get the date right?
I hope so. I can't remember. I went through so many drafts.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I read the last draft, which has got incredible information around Africa and where we are. I want to just start this one a little differently. There's a quote that comes from the introduction that I'd like to read. It says, Africa's path, and Africa is the only region where its debt is growing faster than its gross domestic product. The debt has increased by 183% since 2010. A rate roughly 4 times higher than its growth rate of GDP in dollar terms. And that's a quote from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development in 2023.
Yeah.
Those are some staggering statistics around where we are. And so to dovetail from that quote, Tendai, let's paint a picture about where we are as a continent. What is Africa's context in comparison to the rest of the world?
Yeah. So I don't have a quote. That's an amazing quote. But I also say, the inspiration behind the article, Africa's Path, which sort of took long to write because there's just a lot to sort of digest, comes from a conversation around just a question to say, so what should Africa do? It's a question I asked. It was a random question I asked many people. And in many instances, what I was getting was usually 2 things. Address corruption, arrest those who are doing corruption, then we'll be okay. Others from mineral-rich countries, they just pinned their hopes on the minerals to say, if only we could use our minerals, we'll be okay. But, I think we need some level of sort of interrogation of how we got where we are. Because you're asking the question, what is Africa's context today? But how did you get to today? I think Africa has gone through a number of silver bullet ideas, which were not adequate. The first silver bullet was, only if we become independent. That's modern history. Only if we become independent. So 1957, Ghana gets her independence. Then it becomes something like of a pattern until 1994, South Africa. So all those years, we're just dealing with liberation. And liberation was positioned as a silver spoon, as a silver bullet to say, if we can throw off the yoke of colonialism, we'll be fine. So we did that. Then the next round of the silver bullet was to say, those who have been entrusted with power are abusing it. Some were staying for too long, etc., etc. What do we need? We get a new movement around constitutionalism. So there's a wind of change in Africa where almost all of us are going towards multi-party democracies, where we are throwing away de facto single party. I'm sure this was before your time, before you were born.
We did history, go there.
Okay, so at some point, Africa had become associated with single parties. The liberation or founding parties were running Africa, and they were running for years, different countries. So there's a new agitation emerged to say the challenges we're having is these parties are not accountable, they're not delivering, etc. So the only way to fix Africa is to promote multi-party democracy. We embraced that. We ran with multi-party democracy associated with new constitutions. So almost everywhere you're going, we're rewriting our constitutions, rewriting them, putting in democratic clauses to enforce limited terms for presidents or prime ministers, to enforce many other things, press freedoms, etc. Good things, all of them good things. But still, the economy was still not working. Africans were still poor. Africans remained in the rural area. Africans remained using technology from the Jesus era, the handheld hoe. That's what we're still using to do our agriculture. And some smarties in the World Bank and other institutions says, no, Africa needs structural adjustment programs because Africa is spending more money than it has. Its bureaucracy is bloated. So we came with the term bloated bureaucracies. So we came up with the idea of saying, let's reduce the size of the state. Number 1, you reduce the size of the state. Number 2, you privatize certain functions. So all of us went through structural adjustment programs because we were over-borrowed, we were over-leveraged. So that was a way of managing our borrowing, etc. Because if you can reduce your civil service, which was taking so much of your income, then we're still the same. Nothing has changed. So we've gone through all these reforms and there's little to show for it. I was born just before independence in Zimbabwe, so I lived in. My memories are of Zimbabwe's independence up until now. The one thing that always surprises me is the road to our village. The road to our village has grown narrower and narrower. It has not grown bigger. The people in our village are still using firewood as energy. The people in our village are still walking long distances to access schools, to access clinics. That is the situation. And Maize village is not unique. That's the common trait in Africa. Most of our people in Africa, 55 to 60% of our people live in rural areas. Africa is a young continent. The majority of our people are young. They are unemployed. Where they're economically active, they're in the informal sector. Yeah. Then what have we done politically? We've managed to change governments. There are many countries that
Those
now,
who have managed to change.
quite a number, are able to change governments, except for a few, like your country. But many others have managed to be changing governments, political parties, etc. So I think, in terms of embracing Western liberal democracy, we have done it, or even better than others. We've really implemented constitutionalism, rule of law, electoral democracy. We're seeing changes. If you look at countries like Malawi, Zambia, Kenya, and many others, Ghana, they're changing leaders. But his situation of Africans changed. That's what inspired writing of Africa's Path.
I love that, because in kind of the beginning of your article, you talk about that and how it seems our aspirations have moved from just political change and governance change to talk about, okay, great, so now this democracy thing is not what we're looking for. We're looking for a working economy. How does that benefit me as a citizen? So just to dovetail into the next part of our conversation is to say, we now know where we are.
Yeah.
What are we good at as Africans?
Yeah. So if you allow me maybe just 30 seconds to go back to what you said.
Sure.
I think one of the mistakes we made was to treat the political space as separate from the economic space. So the political space, the prescription was democracy. Then in the economic space, our prescription was foreign direct investment. That will get investors, they come, they will make sure that our economies work. So we spent a lot of time doing what Paul Collier has called the race to the bottom, where we sort of came up with rules to make sure that people can come and invest. And these laws do with, say, tax holidays. You can come as a foreign investor, invest in country X, you don't have to pay a tax for 5 years. We reduced all those. But we were treating these two as separate. And yet, a real functional democracy depends on a stable economy, because there's no way you can have democracy the way we have understood it, as creating stability, a meritocracy of sorts, etc., participation, when you are not active participants in the economy. Because every time we talk to citizens, the organization I work for and many others, when we talk to citizens, their interests are usually in the economic sphere. There are very few instances where I've gone and said, what would you like your country to do? And they started off by listing what you call political and civil rights. But they talk about social and economic rights. They talk about issues to access to jobs, access to money, etc., etc. So I think that's the challenge that we've had, keeping these two as separate when they are linked. So going back to your question to say, what are we good at? I think it's becoming a challenge now for me to even say. Many people have told me all sorts of things. But what we have, I would say what we have. I think Africa still has the largest vast tracts of arable land, which is an asset, if we can use it. That's number one. Africa is possibly outside of maybe Latin America and some parts of Asia. Africa has an abundance of labor. Africa is bulging in the middle, it has labor. So that's an asset. Then Africa has got minerals. Amazing, a wide array of minerals that are needed in the economy of the future to pump renewables, etc., things like lithium, etc. You find it in Africa. So I think those are the things we have. Are we good at exploiting any of those? That's the challenge. Because if we're good at exploiting all of those, Africa will possibly be the best performing economy. Africa's economy will be the best performing. But what it means is, we have all these things and yet we're not utilizing them adequately.
So let's pause. You spoke about 3 areas.
Yeah.
Agriculture, you spoke about mining, and then the number, our power is in the numbers that we have.
Yes.
So let's talk about agriculture. In your article, you talk about how we have arable land, yet we are one of the biggest importers of food.
Yeah, you definitely read the article. Definitely. And I'm impressed. So agriculture is, so I think building upon that article sort of borrows from a book that we've just published, The Shifts in the Land and Agrarian Question in Africa, where we actually talk in more detail around what has happened to the food question in Africa. I think the food question in Africa has been affected by two things. Predominantly, Africa is a continent of smallholder agriculture. And smallholder agriculture, one of its weaknesses is it's what it produces for the market is limited compared to share of production that is done by commercial agriculture.
Right.
So, like I said, 55 to 60% of our people are in the rural areas. And all those people are eking out an existence around very small plots. Yeah. Average in Africa is 2 hectares. And that could be higher for countries like Malawi and Lesotho. So some actually eke out an existence on plots that are less than a hectare. So that's the majority of our people living in that. And actually, there's a gender dimension to it. Most of our smallholder agriculture is actually run by women. The males are trying to do something in the urban areas, etc. So that's number one, around the nature of how the relations of production, how we produce. Then the second one is the share of allocation of national budgets towards agriculture. For many countries that have done well in agriculture, there's been significant investment by government, especially in the earlier stages of that agricultural takeoff. But in our cases, it's only now that we've sort of begun to have this consensus around 10%. Because during structural adjustments, allocations towards agriculture, rural development, had gone to as low as 2 to 3% of budgets. But with Maputo declaration of the AU in 2003, renewed in 2013 in Malabo, those increased to 10%. So a number of countries have increased their allocations. So if you go to something that we call the agriculture performance tracker that we keep, you find that countries like Ethiopia, Rwanda, Ghana, and Malawi have consistently increased their allocations, and production has increased. Even here in Zimbabwe, agricultural production has sort of improved. But still, it's not enough to deal with our import needs. So one of the reasons why we import a lot is also because of the kind of food regime we have in place. We import a lot of wheat because our weather is not conducive for wheat. Zimbabwe has only begun in the past 5-7 years to do what we call winter wheat production at scale. In Zimbabwe, there was a documentary on CNN where they were talking about the winter wheat miracle in Zimbabwe. So Zimbabwe is one of the countries that if they continue on this track, they may become wheat secure. Many countries have a wheat deficit, but you know that all of us love bread, yeah?
Yes, we do.
And so with the moment you're seeing us eat bread in Africa, the majority of that wheat is imported. So the things we eat are imported. So we depend, number one, on wheat that we have to import. But also because of the erratic nature of our rainfall patterns, we have begun to see an increase in the number of grain imports. So that's why we're exposed to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, because Ukraine is a major supply of grain to Africa. So just by the fact that there's that conflict and there's an embargo on trade, etc., Africa was beginning to feel the challenges of food security. So I think there are many things that Africa needs to change. If you were to ask me what could they do to change, Africa needs to go back to its traditional grains. Maize was never our traditional grain. Sorghum, millet, etc., short-term varieties, drought-resistant, they would work well. They're even healthier. But half the time we've been moved into these commodities built and supported by multinationals. So agriculture globally is dominated by multinational corporations, and they've dominated the trade around it. And also another deficit for Africa is we don't produce enough fertilizer for our agriculture.
You mentioned that.
So
it's a type of fertilizer as well.
Yeah, the type of fertilizer. Science has not done much in terms of promoting organic fertilizer. So we mostly depend on synthetic fertilizer, despite the harm that they do to the soil.
So Tendai, you've spoken about, I've picked up two, in case I missed some of the things that you mentioned about, around the challenges around agriculture. The first being that most of our farming is around subsistence farming, and then the size of the land that we have. The second issue also being around the amounts that government is putting into farming. The next one also being around fertilizer.
So you picked 3, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I picked 3. So I picked 2.
I had 3 in my mind. So I think the final one, because I don't want to spend so much time on this one, the final one is around land tenure. Most of this land in Africa is held through a variety of customary tenure, meaning that this land is not owned individually, it's owned by communities, owned over generations, etc. So there are different kinds of clan-based rights, belonging, etc. You just don't own land by going into a communal area and say, I want to buy this portion. You have to belong, you have to be part of it, it's inherited land, etc. But given the fact that agriculture is seen as a sector within a capitalist economy, where financing is done outside of these spaces, is to be done using different kinds of rules. Everywhere else, agriculture is funded through loans, etc. But in many African countries, it's difficult for customary tenure-based farmers to secure access to credit because they don't have title. Remember, you get title deeds over your land. They don't have that. Zimbabwe is embarking on an experiment around issuing of title deeds for smallholder plots, etc. We'll see how that goes. It's a good experiment. We've seen it in Zambia, but those are permits. We've seen it in Kenya as well. We'll see if that could be a more widespread move, because that allows other private sector entities to participate in agricultural markets in a more meaningful way, rather than depending on government alone. So that's one side of tenure. But the second side of tenure is actually maybe the dangerous one. Africa at the moment is going through, or is open up for what we call large-scale land investments. These ones have been on and off, uneven in terms of the numbers and the moments. But at the moment, we have carbon credits, this issue. So it's related to climate change. So polluting countries are being encouraged to purchase carbon credits to offset their pollution. So one way of doing it is to buy what we call carbon sinks. So you come and buy a forest in Africa, then that contributes towards your credits. But what happens in those forests, that land should not be touched. That land should not be used for anything else. But it's based on a misunderstanding even of how smallholder families in rural areas survive, because some smallholder families actually depend off those forests. So that's one side around climate change related land purchases. We're seeing big corporations buying land, etc., around that. But even before then, there was already a movement around the newly emerging oil countries, Dubai and others, Qatar and others, were coming into Africa to undo the food security model the way we'd understood it from a global one. The food security model has always been around, you do not necessarily need to produce all the food. As long as you've got money, you can purchase food. But the 2007, 2008 food crisis led to a moment whereby you might have money, but there's no grain on sale.
Right.
So many countries have decided to say, we'll go and buy land and produce. But in doing that, they're leading to land evictions. We've seen large-scale land investments in Tanzania, in Zambia, in Mozambique, etc., around people who are trying to come and produce land for their own country's use. So that's another challenge that we face. So agriculture generally in Africa, despite being something that we could do well, faces those challenges I've mapped. There's definitely much more that needs to be done. There are quite a number of initiatives being led by the AU and different countries, but we're not doing enough. I think there's not enough political will to move the needle on agriculture, despite the fact that Africa is a rural continent.
It's quite a complex issue. I know you've highlighted the challenges, and in my head, I'm already thinking, so what would that solution be? But I'll park that for now because I want to look at other areas that we seem to be strong at. And in your article, I love the tables that you have that kind of highlight for each of the different regions and then country as well. What do they produce and to what % has that contributed to their GDP?
Sure.
So let's move into the sector around mining, which is our next thing. How are we faring there? So
I think because at times we can sweep over issues, let's use my colleagues within Civil just produced a report on mining revenues. And one of the things that, when I was reviewing that report, one of the things that struck me was the number of multinational companies that dominate the sector. So, and I don't think Zimbabwe is unique. I think actually the mining sector in Africa is multinational dominated. So the question that you're asking is to say, to what extent is multinational mining integrated within national economies? Guy Mone, an economist from Malawi who ended up teaching at Wits, he's left now, he has spoken about this enclave development, that mines come and develop a particular region, a particular area for the purpose of extracting resources. They do not necessarily then create wealth for the entire country. So mines generally, if you go to a mining, I come from Shurugwi, we're close to a mine there. If you go to that mine, the road to my village, the tarred portion ends at their gate. From then on, it's a dust road. But if you go in there and you look at the conditions, they mimic what you find in the city. But everything else is a village. So mines generally are focused mostly on where they are extracting resources. That could make sense because everyone would do that. But the question that we ask is to say, to what extent are mining revenues used to dynamize local economies, to reinvest, etc.? But given the nature that most mining companies that are, especially the strategic minerals, platinum, lithium, and many others, iron, etc., chrome, gold, etc., diamonds, are usually mined by foreign companies. And foreign companies, one of the things that they do when they come into a country is to secure rights to repatriate profits. And they do it with so much efficiency. And also, when they are importing goods, they also make sure that they are not paying duty. Yeah, they find ways around it. So mining, we could list the number of mining companies in a country, but that does not relate to the level of development in that country. Mining companies, over the years, have never been associated with saying, because you've got so many mining activities, then your country is better off. We'll see with the discovery of oil and petroleum products in places like Uganda, Kenya, and also in Namibia. We'll see if in Ghana, we'll see if that changes anything. But generally, the solid minerals that we've been mining have not led to a huge change, even in terms of taxes. So if you want to find people who evade taxes, in many instances,
it's the mining sector.
It's mining companies.
I just wanted to just come in there. When we did one of our previous podcasts and we're looking at Botswana, their economy is kind of centered and founded around mining, specifically diamonds. And when we spoke to the country researcher, his issue was, okay, so the diamonds are running out. So where do we go from here? I'm wondering if that's the story for many of the African countries whose economy is being held up by mining.
That's the challenge with mineral resources. They're not infinite. They're finite resources. So they're going to end at some time, at some point. And I think what compounds the diamond story is the fact that globally there's an increasing appetite for synthetic diamonds. They're being manufactured in laboratories. They are not associated with child labor, which was one of the issues around diamonds, to say we're getting diamonds that abuse child labor, etc. So these ones are selling at a better price. There's no way the mining company can compete with whoever is producing synthetic diamonds. But globally, so we've seen an upsurge in that. So before they even exhaust the diamonds, the market itself is changing.
Right.
So, and there are many countries that have gone through an exhaustion of a resource. Zambia at some point no longer was struggling with copper. Copper prices had sort of collapsed, etc., etc. So one of the things that we have learned is to say, if your country is dominated by mining, it is potentially the most risky sort of country, but you have to diversify quickly. But diversification is not something that you do overnight. You need to have a strategy, 10, 15 year, 20-year strategy. Because if you look at the oil countries like UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and others, they've already begun to project what will happen when their oil deposits are beginning to run out. So they've already begun to diversify their economies. But here, we're yet to do that because it's our level of ownership of those mineral resources. Because if we owned, or if they were owned by a national bourgeois, a national business class, then that national business class was reinvesting in other sectors, in real estate, in construction, in manufacturing. Locally, it would help. But the challenge is MNCs, the multinational corporations, do not reinvest.
I want to come in with a side track on that. You spoke about how these mining entities get into communities and only develop their part of that community. What about the conversation around corporate social responsibility? Do you think it would change the color and the nature in which mining companies then work within those communities or in countries?
We're active in that space. Corporate social responsibility, honestly, will not move the needle around the structure of an economy. Because you're talking about maybe 3% of your revenues, and they always dilute it anyway. By the time they give it to you, it's less than 1% of your revenue. So let's just use figures here. A platinum mine in Shurugu is called Unki. In 1 year, they made 1.2 billion. And if that mining company was owned in Zimbabwe, wholly owned in Zimbabwe, even if it had debts to service local banks, it would have maybe a net profit of 400 million. And if that 400 million was reinvested in Zimbabwe, in other sectors of the economy, in agriculture, etc., can you imagine the multiplier effect it would have? So what many mineral-bearing countries are missing out is the multiplier effect that comes from mining revenues, because they are not then reinvested or even put in Zimbabwean banks or South African banks or whatever banks that they begin to. Because at the moment, if you have to ask business in manufacturing, one of the challenges they are facing is the cost of finance. There's not enough for them to expand their manufacturing, etc. But yet we understand that the classic transition has to be a transition from primary products to value-added products through a process that we call industrialization that leads you to be dominated by manufacturing. But at the moment, manufacturing in many of our African countries contributes less than 10% to GDP. So we're talking about integration. To what extent can agriculture and mining contribute towards enhancing manufacturing capabilities and also financial services? Because now if these mining companies have surplus and they're investing in their country, the financial service sector has to come up with many products to absorb this money and reinvest in the economy. All that is missing at the moment because of the nature in which agriculture and mining are structured. So that's the challenge that we have. So for us to move to the next level where we become like any other region, where we now become, say, we're employing more people in manufacturing than in these other two sectors. Because at the moment, many African countries, their labor is in agriculture. But it's not an ideal position, because agriculture, we know you can mechanize, you can automate, and you move people out of agriculture into industry.
So pausing there, in your article, you talk about manufacturing and how it seems kind of the bigger countries that were in manufacturing are kind of moving out of that area. For example, China is now focusing more on technology and they're moving away from manufacturing. Is manufacturing a viable path for us as Africans?
So I sort of wrote in a very linear way. I'm glad you caught that. In a linear way around how countries develop. Because I was looking at Western development, the transitions that have happened since the turn of the 19th century, from the early days of the Industrial Revolution, etc. So in manufacturing, there are things that we call lower order goods. They're not so sophisticated. And the first one, if you look even at the Industrial Revolution, it was around how to make cloth. Very easy technology that you could just use your hand, etc. So we began to see that grow, especially in the United Kingdom, Britain, France, Germany. Then we also saw it grow in the US. Then at a certain point, they sort of ditched that. They moved into a higher order, what you call higher order industrialization, where you begin to talk about maybe the automotive industry, etc., etc. But they were not saying people no longer need to dress. They were sort of leaving that off to countries that were emerging. And at that time, it was China, India, and Malaysia, Indonesia, and others that were emerging into that space. So I was cheekily sort of trying to say, we were also expecting our turn, that China, Indonesia, India, and others would sort of give up to say, this is no longer giving us the returns. Our labor is less. We cannot be putting our labor towards manufacturing of clothing apparel. We can now outsource clothing from other countries. So Africa, especially if you look at Ethiopia, the infrastructure that they had put, and Egypt, is an anticipation to say the clothing sector is now coming to Africa. We're now ready to clothe the world. But it does not happen. Something disrupts it, and that is AI. automation happens. We now have large manufacturing plants of apparel that are now run by humanoids. These are robots that have been created through using AI that are producing more clothes than you would ever produce in a factory run by humans.
And at less cost.
Less cost. So that's the disruption of what I was talking about. If you're looking at cycles or stages of development, because there are many economists like Rostow and others who have talked about stages of development. So even for us, the assumption that our shift from this agrarian base is going to be coming through when we become the manufacturers of clothing for the world. We become the tailors of the world.
But should we shift from agrarian-based development?
We should. Because at the moment, there are lower incomes. And because it's so smallholder-based, there's less scale. We are not able to harness scale. Because for you to harness scale from agriculture, you need large scale. So the reason why our people are stuck there is because there are no opportunities elsewhere. Because if industry had opened up the way we saw it open around clothing, apparel in China, etc., it would absorb labor.
But Tendai, can I come in and be very controversial? It might be that I have not read around the subject much. But when we look at China and its manufacturing and then the type of labor that they have, where we talk about the sweatshops, can we say then we are also supposed to then go through that? Because if you're looking at the small-scale farmers and you're saying they're not producing enough, wouldn't we rather than just find a way to kind of bring our land together and produce more rather than trying to go back to manufacturing? Because if I am making a portion of what someone makes in town with the proper job from agriculture, then I come and they open up manufacturing shops and I'm still kind of getting the same pay. But is that helpful for me? I don't know if I'm making sense.
I agree. But number one, you're not going back to manufacturing. You're going ahead into manufacturing. Because manufacturing is the next stage after producing of primary goods. So you're going into the next stage. From a linear perspective, the next stage is some level of sophistication. You're producing this wheat, you're growing this, cotton. You're producing this cotton and you're sending it all over the world in bales and with no level of processing. But we're saying the next level of processing is convert this into cloth. Yeah? That's the technology we need. So if you do that, but I hear your concern around sweatshops. China has got that aberration. There's that challenge around it. But if you look at the progressive movements in South Africa, trade unions, they've really challenged the low cost or the low wage model to say that workers need to be paid a fair wage. So I subscribe to that. But what we're saying is the next level of development in any country you should be able to at least clothe yourselves. So if you look at the amounts of money we spend on importing clothing, apparel, it's a disaster. So you don't start off by saying we want to clothe the world. You start off by clothing yourselves. You spend 5 years, 10 years refining that model until you come to a place whereby you have now producing more than what you need, then you export. So at the moment, we import over 50% of what we wear. Yeah. If you look at the manufacturing sector around clothing, in Zimbabwe, there's little pockets of recovery. Because Zimbabwe and South Africa are different from the rest of Africa. Because Zimbabwe and South Africa, they had some textile industry that collapsed during structural adjustment. So there's some recovery. But everywhere else in Africa, there's never had that capability to manufacture clothes.
It's such a dynamic issue around manufacturing, and it's specifically because you've chosen clothing as the matter of discussion. Because one, if we are still importing and it's cheaper for us to import than to manufacture, that's one aspect. And then there's also the issue that you actually talk about in your article around secondhand clothing and that market and how big it is in Africa. So if we're manufacturing, I'm trying to figure out what then that means for trade and what government needs to do in order to support its in-house manufacturing. But we can pause that.
No, it's fine. No. I'm happy to discuss it because, we can pause after this. But I'm happy to discuss it because what it is, it's second-hand clothing. We are a solution to somebody's problem. There's somebody who's struggling to dump clothes they no longer want, and they're dumping them on Africa. So for me, it's like, is that what we want to be known for as African? So if you look at countries like Rwanda, the kind of policies they're putting in place, bans on second-hand clothes, maybe that's what, for us to grow our manufacturing capabilities, we need to give them what? space to compete. But at the moment, how do you compete with second-hand clothes? That's what is killing the little manufacturing that we have.
And so are the imports of way cheaper clothing from countries such as China. So that's also another issue that we need to deal with.
Yeah, now, okay. Now, now okay. No. Yeah. And it's okay. But I think so what happened with structural adjustment? Structural adjustment was just not about lowering government costs, etc., dealing with the bureaucracy, but they also introduced something called the Open General Import License. So how you protect your industry is what we call a tariff regime, which is what President Trump is doing in the US right now, imposing tariffs on goods coming from China, coming from elsewhere. So we had tariffs, but we were advised that tariffs are not helping you. So we quickly removed tariffs. So I'll give you an example of Zimbabwe, a country that I'm intimately associated with. So if you look at Zimbabwe, by the time we adopt Open General Import License as a policy, when we remove tariffs, especially on textiles, 5 companies closed in the space of 24 months. That's Contextiles in Tungwiza, David Whitehead between Chegutu and Kadoma, Melin in Bulawayo, and Ascot Clothing in Bulawayo. They all closed within a matter of 24 hours because what they were producing, they could no longer compete with goods that were being brought in from China and India. A pair of socks that Melin was producing for this country was landing at 10 cents. And they could not compete. Towels, they were landing at a cheaper cost. So for you to do manufacturing, you also need to be thinking about your tariff regime to protect that. So in terms of tariffs, I sort of understand President Trump, where he's coming from, because there's no way you're going to protect manufacturing in the US competing with cheap imports that are coming from Asia. So you either say, we're not going the route of manufacturing, we give up on this, then we're just going to do other things. But America may have a choice. America may go for higher order goods, services, etc., which was the thinking for years, to say America, the UK, and many other developed Western economies will focus on higher order goods, and they were focusing on services. But President Trump believes that manufacturing needs to return to America. So he's pushing through tariffs, and he's trying to encourage even companies that had outsourced their production to Mexico and others to bring them back to America. But I don't think Africa has a choice. Africa has to do all it can to make sure that it has got some manufacturing capability. Africa has to be able to, number one, clothe yourself and feed yourself. So yes, we've spoken a lot about manufacturing from a clothing perspective, but it's also around food. Do you understand? I spent a lot of time when I was just finished my undergraduate studies at a border post between Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Malawi. And I would observe bales of sugar coming from Malawi, going to South Africa. I would observe sugar going back to Malawi, now packaged. So that means that there was no packaging in Malawi. Sugar was being produced in Malawi, going to South Africa. Then Malawi imports sugar. Now it's more expensive. So the amount of raw sugar that is going in bigger bales is cheaper in terms of costing compared to this packaged one. So some of the things that we're talking about are not as sophisticated as they seem to others. We're just saying, we'll call it the next step. Just do one more step to whatever you're producing. So with tobacco, you don't need to be producing as much tobacco as Zimbabwe is producing. You have a latent market around cigars, but you're not producing that. You're not producing cigarettes. So imagine if you're producing the bulk of your tobacco, converting it into cigarettes and exporting it. You'll actually earn much more, because the moment it's converted into cigarettes, the value increases by 10.
Right.
So that's what we're talking about.
So I want to rein this conversation back in.
Okay.
And I think we should do a part 2, because there's so much that is in this article, and it's absolutely incredible for me. But I think I'm going to conclude it here so that we can do a part 2 of it.
Okay.
And our conclusion is going to be around what kind of, I don't want to call it a sector or economy, does Africa need to have? It's something that you touch on in the article around like an entrepreneurial kind of facing Africa that will help us move on to a better form of development for the continent. Do you want to just speak into that? Is that the only way?
I think Africa has been caught in between two sort of places when you're looking at the marketplace. Africa has been caught in between, on the one hand, the state trying to run what we generically call parastatals or state-owned enterprises, and also the idea around securing foreign direct investment. So those have been like the two drivers. You know what I mean? You measure, so almost every sector there's a state-owned enterprise, a parastatal. But if you look at how those state-owned enterprises operate, it's not entrepreneurial at all. They're actually top-heavy, and they're actually a drain on the fiscus. In many instances, if you look at corruption scandals in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, and in Zambia, it's mostly the playground for corruption. Where it ferments and it grows is in state-owned enterprises. So there was a movement during structural adjustment around privatization. Many African governments, including Zimbabwe, sort of resisted it. They only privatized a few and then commercialized others. I think that was a missed opportunity because in that there was an opportunity around unbundling and also then creating a national bourgeois that is then sort of developed into running these, but with ownership. So I do not think Africa can develop without its own national business class, its own locals running the commanding heights of the economy, be it in agriculture, be it in mining, etc. You need, because that is a more accountable class of business people than foreign-owned businesses. Right. And normally, the local businesses tend to reinvest within the country. There are incentives for them to reinvest. So you find integration within the economy. At the moment, our economies are characterized by silo-based sectors, that there's no integration. But if you begin to imagine it that way, that can only happen if we start at the state. The state needs to be an entrepreneurial state. An entrepreneurial state
Paint a picture for me. What is that?
An entrepreneurial state is one that, on the one hand, has some imagination. If for lack of a better word, I look at Rwanda. I find the Rwandan state, in terms of what it has done, not through state-owned enterprises, but through partnerships, through creating these nodes whereby you are encouraging investors, but you're encouraging local ownership, etc., but also you are reducing the burden of compliance. Because at times, if you look, it's only now in countries like Zimbabwe where things are changing. For a dairy farmer in Zimbabwe, they needed 26 permits. That's not an entrepreneurial state. You're not encouraging entrepreneurship at all. So if you look at the barricades that they put around compliance, the building code, for you to build something, the amount of hurdles you have to go through, that does not encourage investors, whether local or foreign, because you create so many challenges. So an entrepreneurial state will be something that mirrors what entrepreneurs want and understands the need. Because my argument is to say, if there's a silver bullet in Africa, one of it has to contain an entrepreneurialism, pushing entrepreneurs, not small entrepreneurs running SMEs, whatever, but at a large scale, really begin to trust local businesses with the commanding heights of the economy. Make it, because you know what? Already, let me use a contradiction. A foreign investor in a country like Zimbabwe, Botswana, Zambia, when they come in to invest, they most probably are going to get a tax holiday, especially when they're going to mining, because it's a capital-intensive sector, of 5 years or 6 years. A local will not get that tax holiday. Yeah? So that's why I'm saying that we, without acknowledging, we actually keep our people outside of the real sectors. So we end up having people playing in the facilitation space, conferencing space, but they're not producing any goods. But if you really begin to create incentives and make it easy for them to participate, direct the monies that we are using as subsidies to subsidize these state-owned enterprises, direct it towards these, or even reduce share ownership of government in state-owned enterprises and sort of encourage local shareholding into entities that run mobile telephone networks, etc., etc. There's no reason for a government to be involved in that. Yeah?
I agree. I have growing concerns, and I don't know if that's like the negative part of me. I know you spoke about the red tape, bureaucracy, and compliance issues that people have to deal with. But my worry, of which may not be founded on anything, might be when we create or bring about these entrepreneurs to, push development, are we also not creating they're not called elitist. You can help me with the English there.
Yeah, but
I guess it's the cost that we kind of risk that you take.
But everyone right now, people who are interested in development studies, we're celebrating China one way or the other. World studies are celebrating China one way or the other. It's the country that has produced the highest number of millionaires and billionaires in the shortest time. Why is that? Because government encouraged it. But we are now accepting Chinese investors to come and invest in our economies. Why are we not creating our own millionaires and billionaires? Unless if we say that we have an alternative development framework that does not need business, that is dependent on the state on its own.
No.
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Yeah. So somewhere in the middle, but for us, we think that we have actually made it so difficult for those who will be willing to participate in the commanding heights of their national economies. We've made it so difficult for them, and yet we've made it easy for non-nationals to come and participate in the same sectors.
I think I'm going to park it there, right? It's a juicy place for us to come back and carry on this discussion.
Sure.
So just in case, we've spoken about so many things, you are a little lost on where we are. We are talking about Africa's path. And Africa's path around development. We've looked at aspects around agriculture, mining, manufacturing, and now we're looking at the kind of continent that Africa has to be, and that's around entrepreneurship, which is where we came into this. Tendai, I'm going to put you on the spot. What can people expect in part 2?
Oh, well, I think we need to be forward-looking to really map opportunities for Africa. Was this one? I think what we have just done now is something that I come across in many meetings where we dissect the issue very well, but we have no suggestions for going forward. So I hope that in part 2, we can focus more on what needs to be done.
Right. Tonight, thank you for joining me.
Sure.
And our debate on entrepreneurship and African entrepreneurs will continue in part 2. So if you would like to read this article, it's available on www.cvoinstitute.org. It's called The Path. Africa's Path. And it's a very insightful piece. I was blown away by some of the statistics that you quoted in that article. So please do go ahead and read that. Join us in our next episode as we kind of delve in a little deeper around this article and the issues that it discusses. My name is Lonzo Yelelo. I was joined by Tendai. We hope to see you again soon. Goodbye for now. To subscribe, you can look for What If We Think Differently on Spotify. You can also look for What If We Think Differently on Apple Podcasts. On YouTube, you will find us on CVO TV. To stay up to date with all our episodes, don't forget to subscribe.